Welcome here to New London Architecture. My name's Peter Murray. I'm chairman of NLA and will be chairing proceedings this morning. For those of you who are new to NLA, we are the focus for debate and discussion about London's built environment. And as Dave Hill wrote yesterday in his excellent article on what mayoral candidates are planning to do to the West End, influential think tank. So anything Dave Hill says to me is gospel, so go along with that. So today we're going to be looking at aspects surrounding our exhibition upstairs on the future of London's roads, and we've got an excellent lineup of speakers to give us a picture of what changes are taking place, how we're going to accommodate the huge growth in population, impact of new infrastructure like Crossrail. And to start us off, very pleased to have Chris Bure, who's the Director of Social Research Associates, who's going to look at some of the impacts of changing population in London and how we deal with streets. Chris, over to you.
Thank you. Good morning, everyone. The picture you see there, Mixed Priority Routes, was a study which the Department of Transport funded in 2008. And the idea of the study was to set up a lot of pilot projects around the country where we were going to make sure that all road users had a good deal. So pavements were widened, parking was reduced, but there was still a strong sense that motorised transport had a place there. And I looked at that report when I was invited to speak here today, and what I was astonished to realise was how out of date it was only 8 years later, how fast things had moved in the last 8 years. And thinking particularly of London streets, I don't intend to go into detail because I've only got 10 minutes, but we know there are more people, more pedestrians, more scooters, more cyclists. Declining car use. Have just published a lot of research about the reasons behind that, particularly in London. But we do know more light vans. We know there are more visitors, more multi-use, so people that don't necessarily leap in their cars these days understand how to use the public transport system and make that choice. Longer hours of activity and constant connectivity. All those things have changed really since 2008. And I think the exciting thing about that is that there are therefore lots of new opportunities, and these are the issues I want to raise from the next 10 minutes. So first of all, engineering and ITS. And I know there will be a lot of people here who are far more expert than I am about these opportunities. But what I do know from my colleagues in ITS UK is that traffic management can prioritise in real time now. Particularly, I'm very involved with the pedestrian issues, making a TV programme about walking at the moment. And we know that for the first time, pedestrians can be built in to scoot systems and traffic management systems in a way they couldn't before. Navigation apps are very common these days. People don't get lost as much as they did before, and we can be smart about how we suggest to people they should walk. There are lessons from other industries. A lot of the retail trade, for instance, that I'm working with are using ITS in real time to affect how people work. And then finally, I do a lot of work with the public here, and there are all sorts of products coming from ITS which enable local communities to have some ownership of their street and road environment. For instance, there's a firm in the northeast who've developed this very user-friendly emote product where local people can monitor pollution in real time in their own street. So a lot of ITS and engineering development. And then street design. I said earlier that we're moving towards 24-hour, 7-day activity, and that means that streets are different at different times of the day. Did some work recently in Sheffield on road safety, where a certain street was, if you like, described at different times of the day, and there were 3 distinct periods there. The morning, which was predominantly used by elderly people who didn't do much shopping but had coffee, people going to work, and then moving on right to the evening when there was a lot of drinking going on, clubbing, and for that reason the street was redesigned, traffic closed, rising bollards and so on, and it was like designing your own room in your house at different times of the day. Lighting, we've moved on a lot with lighting, and London is a good example of how lighting is completely changing the way people move around, the way they perceive security and so on, and you can do a lot with lighting that we didn't know about 8 years ago. And finally, seating and planting. There's still a lot to learn. I'm very well aware I'm talking here today about building design, for instance, in this building, and here are two examples of seating design, one which is not very good for an ageing population, and a seat with a back which is. So that's why it's a good thing that architects are more and more getting involved in street design, coming outside the housing and built environment. And then there's psychology and behavioural economics. I do a lot of work with the retail trade about how they design internal spaces. And the picture there is of a typical supermarket, which I'm sure people here are aware of the way in which they very carefully design their products, where they put the eggs, where they put the vegetables, what eye level height things are and so on. Now sometimes there's a conflict there between what the public needs and what the retailer needs, but generally the skills are there. The second picture is of a very large department store. This is work that I did actually 5 years ago, where we tracked how people walked around a large department store and how their movement and their flow was very amenable to psychology and to colour and placement and so on. So in the end we could pretty well predict where people were going to stop, what they were going to touch, which way they would walk and so on. Now clearly there are implications there for streets, and here it's not very good quality picture because it's from a video we've made, but it's people walking over London Bridge in the morning, and as you can see a whole load of people are walking one side, not many the other side. Now you may say, well, they've arrived at London Bridge station as commuters, and actually they walk on the first side, but what we discovered was a lot of them then cross over turning left at the other end of London Bridge, so they haven't gained by walking on that side. The psychology of movement and so on, just imagine how you would apply that to a crowded street where there is conflict between cyclists and pedestrians and so on. We're not doing enough of that kind of thing. Now I know some of my colleagues will talk about hubs later on perhaps, but here is a typical suburban parcel pickup point. A rather unpleasant place to be, rubbish, stuff all over the place. We've talked about hubs in urban areas, and there are new ways of designing hubs. This is a place that quite a lot of people will go, and we probably want them to go if we want to reduce vans in our streets, but it's not a very pleasant place. Why not have seating? Why not have other things that they would do? Why not have a good crossing for the local school there and so on? So there's a lot about this, and policy is an important part, because if we're going to do a lot of these things in our London streets, we don't have the policy in place to do it. We don't have the policy for shared data, for fusing data, and so on. Planning rules are often holding us up, restricting opening hours, and of course there are even further issues which I haven't time to talk about today, about extending the congestion boundary, about should we have actually a daytime lorry ban rather than a nighttime lorry ban, and so on. So we've got a lot we could do as a tool there for policy. My conclusion is, looking around, we need new toolkits for all this. They don't really exist in the way that we need them to do. We need to customise each street design. Local people feel their local streets are very important, and getting them involved in designing their streets, even things like Towerbridge Road recently has put up a statue to a local hero from the First World War and incorporated that in a street design. Here's a new seating area in Tooley Street in Southwark, which is actually creating quite a nice barrier between traffic with trees and planting and so on. There's so much we could do, each street giving its own badge and so on. So we want local interests to own this, because we want them to look after their streets as well, because we can't afford to have them constantly cleaned up. Working across traditional professional boundaries is so important here, and one thing I think hasn't changed since 2008 is divisions, particularly in local authority areas, between, say, transport planning, transport engineering. it's still amazingly separate, and road safety is often somewhere else and architecture somewhere else. So working across traditional boundaries. And finally, I just want to say something about encouraging good manners. And our research is showing that in London particularly, people in the public realm are much better behaved than they used to be. And here's a picture, for instance, of someone giving way to a pedestrian and so on. I myself belong to Flash Mob, and we've been doing quite a lot in this area of encouraging good behaviour, where we put a bottle down by a bin and watch everybody walking past, and then finally someone puts it in a bin and the Flash Mob appear with red hats and cheer. So have a look on YouTube, I've put the link up there. I haven't time to show it to you, but it's good fun. So I think my conclusion really is that all you people here are in the business of a very exciting new era, and I'm saying think about streets as you might think about your own sitting room. And there's so much we could do to manage our London streets, to make them better, and to meet the challenges I started off by listing. I know some of our speakers are going to go into lots more detail here, and there's lots of great stuff out there. So we're all living in exciting days. Go for it. Thank you.
Thank you, Chris. Very reassuring. I shall look at that YouTube film and be reassured that we are all operating more with better manners in public space now. So, and somebody who has been closely involved over the last decade or so in terms of that revolution and the way we deal with streets in London is Ben Plowden, who's now Director of Surface Strategy, Planning and Transport at Transport for London. Of course, somebody who moved from pressure group to policy maker, so very pleased to have him here this morning to talk about the future of London streets. Ben.
Thank you very much, Peter. Good morning, everybody. As Peter said, in a former life, I was the chief executive of the charity Living Streets, and it's been absolutely fascinating moving first from outside a big bureaucracy like TfL to inside it, but also to see the extraordinary change in the terms of the debate about streets, what they're for, how we should manage them, how we balance between different priorities. So what I want to do this morning is just talk very quickly about the kind of broad context for thinking about the future of roads and streets in London, but potentially for any other big city, indeed any other town really in the UK and internationally, because how we think about the apportionment of a finite amount of space and capacity and how we optimise the use of that capacity is the key question for any city, I think, that's not planning a major expansion of its urban road network, which I don't think London is likely to do. So what are the challenges facing the road network in London? The first one is the very old-fashioned transport planning dilemma that demand on the road network is set to grow very sharply as a consequence of London's continuing economic and population growth. And at the moment, anyway, there is no sign that any political interest is proposing a major increase in the supply of roads in London. We're not looking at proposals for a major programme of urban motorway building like we did in the mid to late 1980s. I don't think anyone's going to propose building a new Westway anytime soon. So there's a real problem here, which is that the growth in demand of the network, with a broadly speaking fixed amount of capacity, could generate very substantial congestion, which essentially means journeys taking longer on the road than they normally would. And the estimates that we've done for a piece of work around the Roads Task Force suggest that if we don't deal with this issue, congestion could rise by as much as 60% in central London, 25% in inner London, and up to 15% in outer London. Now that obviously reflects the availability of carriageway space, the density of population and housing and development, but nonetheless, if you think about congestion in central London now, that being 60% worse in 20 or 30 years' time is really quite a significant challenge for policymakers and people who operate the transport network, not least because of the costs associated with that for business trying to move goods and services around the city, and indeed for the bus network and anybody else trying to make their way around the city. So that's the first challenge, which is if you like, a classic transport planning challenge, which is how do you manage a rise in demand on a network which certainly in the short term is essentially fixed in capacity. The second problem for policymakers in London is that not only is demand rising overall, but there is competing demand between different users and users of the road network. If I get a pedestrian crossing outside my children's primary school, you can't drive your van quite as quickly as you could yesterday to the store that you're delivering newspapers or milk or whatever to. If we improve the town centre in an outer London borough to make it more attractive in terms of retail and the local community, the chances are that will have an effect on its ability to, for example, accommodate freight waiting and loading, or it might have to move the bus stops. So we're increasingly talking about trading off between different uses of and users of the network, and the debate currently going around the impacts of providing cycle lanes on the embankment or across central London in order to by taking away space from other road users is a classic example of that trade-off that you're being asked to make all the time between different users. And the question then is, how do you optimise the set of outcomes you're going to get from the network in terms of social, economic and environmental benefit? Then when we think about roads, we think of them in a variety of ways, but one of the things that roads are is a set of physical assets: carriageway space, footway space, bollards, railings, benches, traffic lights, CCTV cameras. And we generally, in transport planning terms, think about the value of that network in terms of the asset value of what it would cost to replace those assets if they, for example, should decay or collapse in the case of the Hammersmith flyover. What would it cost to replace those physical assets? So we tend to think about the road network's value as the asset value of the physical infrastructure that makes it up. But in fact, the value of the road network isn't really about the value of the assets that comprise it. It's about the flow of services that the economy and society gets from those assets. So this is a set of fixed assets that we use for a variety of social and economic purposes, and the true value of that network is, as I say, the value of the services that flow from it, in exactly the same way that the value of a power station is actually the value of the electricity or the other power that is generated by the fixed asset of the power station and transmission system. And the crucial insight that the Roads Task Force came up with, and the Roads Task Force was a piece of work that the Mayor set up after the 2012 election, brought together all the key stakeholders to talk about this set of dilemmas and challenges and opportunities, is that there are two broad types of services that a road network provides for the economy and for society. The first is the traditionally regarded set of functions, which is the moving function of the road network. And by the way, in case you think this artwork is by my 11-year-old daughter, it's actually my artwork, and there are signed copies available upstairs after. So the first traditional assumption is that roads are really about moving stuff: people, goods, services, down corridors, down veins, down arteries. And I should stress that this is not just about moving traffic, it's about pedestrians walking down and across roads, it's around cyclists, it's around taxis, it's around vans carrying bread to the supermarket. All the stuff, the people that have to flow down these corridors, is how we have traditionally thought of the core function of the road network. Now, the critical insight that the Road Task Force adopted, based on some work by somebody called Peter Jones, Professor Peter Jones, who's now at UCL, is that there's another very important set of functions, and increasingly in the 21st century, these functions are as important for the economic and social competitiveness and health of a city as the moving function that the roads traditionally have performed. And that, another brilliant piece of art, you might agree, is the living functions of the roads in the city. Now, 80% of the public space in London is its roads and streets, not the parks, not the canal towpaths, not the other kind of traditional public spaces. It is the basic street network that the city is built around. And this function, the living function, space for retail, for culture, for leisure, for watching the world go by in a street-side cafe, is increasingly important in those cities like London, New York, Paris, where you are trying to attract the sorts of industries that require a high-quality living experience for people who live, work, and visit those cities. So if you could talk to people in the Corporation of London about what's important to them as an international financial centre, it is absolutely about the combination of getting people to the City of London quickly, efficiently and safely, and when people are there, being able to experience an environment that means that it's more attractive than the alternative places they could have located their bank, Frankfurt, Paris, New York, wherever it might be. And that's also very important, of course, not just in central London, but for town centres all over the city. Romford, Barking, Woolwich, these are places where people are expecting increasingly that the places where they go out and spend time and money when they're working or at the weekends are places you actually want to spend time and money rather than having to endure the consequences of heavy traffic. Now, if you think about those two functions, moving and living. They're not actually on a spectrum with living at one end and moving at the other. You have to think about them jointly to work out how to deal with the trade-offs and the conflicts between different uses of the city. And the Roads Task Force came up with this 9-box matrix, which basically describes streets in a city according to whether they're low, medium or high for movement, and low, medium and high for place. So up here, for example, a high movement, low place road would be a road like the A13 in East London. A big dual carriageway for most of its length. It carries a substantial amount of freight traffic from beyond the M25, the East Coast ports in some cases, right the way into central London. This is a busy industrial road where you ought to be able to expect to cross that road safely, but the chances are you wouldn't want to wander around drinking coffee by the side of it with your children playing in the fountains. It's not that kind of place. Down in the bottom right-hand corner, high place, low movement would be Covent Garden Piazza. You would certainly need to be able to drive a lorry or van into Covent Garden Piazza, but you really wouldn't expect to go more than about 5, 6, 7 miles an hour because it's clearly an internationally important place whose primary function is social life, culture, retail, street performance, all the things that make those sorts of spaces so important. Now, needless to say, that the most difficult streets to think about, plan for, and manage are the ones in the middle axis, because up here you've got busy urban roads carrying important volumes of people and goods passing through places. Brixton Town Centre, which is also the A23. The Angel, Upper Street, when it's the A1. Suburban town centres where you have big arterial roads passing to and through those streets, where you're also trying to create environments where people can go to the shops, visit the sports centre, take their kids to school, go to the doctors, whatever it might be. And that's really where the challenge comes in trying to combine the moving function of a road and the stopping that you require, bus stops, freight loading bays, parking bays, all those sorts of things, with the movement function that road provides. So, various things have flowed from the Roads Task Force. There's work going on what we call the strategic measures, but I want to come back to the street types in a second because that's in many ways the most interesting. So there's work going on around what is the scope for putting some existing roads underground, whereby you would free up the space at the surface for development, for public space, for walking, for cycling, for other sorts of purposes. And there's various bits of work going on internally around looking at a combination of potentially longer distance tunnels bypassing central London, but also the scope for much shorter tunnels in certain areas, like actually on the A13, where you would essentially deck over the existing road, create a whole new space on the surface, and therefore, if you like, swap the surface capacity for underground capacity. There's work going on looking at further options around charging. Caroline Pidgeon, the Lib Dem mayoral candidate, has just this morning announced that she will put in her manifesto increasing and varying the central London congestion charge and looking at a potential pilot zone around Heathrow. We're doing some work with London councils around the practical implications of extending the ultra-low emission zone beyond the central London area. So there's a very lively debate around charging for the road network, and the Roads Task Force was absolutely clear that issue has to stay on the agenda. And then finally, some very important work going on around freight, because there are lots of options for personal travel. You can walk instead of driving, you can cycle instead of taking the tube. It's much more difficult to move goods and services around the network by public transport. So the question for us, and Chris touched on this in terms of lorry bans and so on, is how do you manage the combination of moving the economy around in vans and lorries with the fact that freight is an important part of peak time traffic and raises lots of issues around congestion and also around safety. But I just want to finish by talking a bit more detail about the street types work that came out of that 9-box matrix. So this is London's road network in the way that you traditionally think about it, which is the TNRN roads, which are the ones managed by Transport for London, and then the SRN, which is the strategic road network, which is the big roads managed by the boroughs. Now that's traditionally how we think of the road network, is whose road is it, and what is it called? Is it an A road, is it a B road? But that doesn't give you a very good sense of why the road is important or what its function is. So what we've been doing is working with the boroughs over the last 18 months since the Roads Task Force reported, and we've been looking at every single street in London according to where it sits on that 9-box model. What kind of street is this in terms of the functions it's performing for the local community and for the wider economy and society of London? So if you marry together data around place, retail footfall, important buildings or parks, cultural sites, places, the things that make a place important to the place, and you marry that with the data around movement, bus journey reliability, volume of traffic going down that street, how many pedestrians and cyclists use that street to move along them, you can start mapping the network according to where it sits on that 9-box model. And we've now got, you start with the movement function, because that's where, if you like, the data is most extensive, and also if you start with that as the base layer. And you then look at all the data you've got about movement, so bus journeys, walking journeys, cycling journeys, car journeys, van journeys, all those sorts of things. You say, which of these roads are important for their movement function? You then do the same for place. Is this a locally important place, a regionally important place, or a neighbourhood place? Is it a local parade of high streets, or is it Covent Garden Piazza? What's the status and significance of this place in terms of either local community or London as a whole? And what that does is it generates this map, which essentially is, at a very high level, the entire road network in London mapped according to where the streets in London sit on that 9-box matrix. Now, why is that important? Because it allows you to start having quite a different sort of conversation about what this street network is for. We are now piloting 20-mile-an-hour speed limits on the TLRN, the London TfL road network, because of the sorts of streets which actually require slow-moving traffic. 4 or 5 years ago, it would have been extremely difficult to make the case in turning TfL to put a 20-mile-an-hour speed limit on a TfL road. It's a TLRN, we can't do that, it's a big red route. Well, it's actually not. It's some of these roads, Chris mentioned Chudley Street, that is part of the TLRN, but it's clearly not like the A13. So thinking about how you design for, manage and operate a road network becomes much more interesting when you're thinking about the function of the roads than thinking about whose road it is or whether it's an A road or a B road. So that's all I wanted to say. I think this is a really interesting time to be involved in this debate, because thinking about the function of streets in cities, both in the UK and internationally, is rapidly becoming one of the key issues for how you reconcile high quality urban life, equitable, fair, environmentally high quality life, with the requirement to keep the city's arteries moving. And I tell you, this is not an easy question to answer, so if you've got the answer, see me afterwards. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Ben, and I think the whole street types ideas and the work that RTF and TfL have been a real game changer in the way complex cities like London operate. So now we're going to look at the wider London, the boroughs, because of course they look after lots of our roads and streets in London, not just TfL. And to tell us about that, we have Nick Lester, who's Corporate Director of Services at London Council. Nick.
Well, thank you very much. I'm anxious not to repeat too much of what Ben has said, because this is one area I think that TfL and the London boroughs do have a huge degree of commonality in at the moment. Just to set out a couple of things at the start. Roads are a critical issue for London's boroughs. Not only do boroughs control 95% of London's roads, all of the local residential roads, but also up to most of the major busiest bus routes are part of the borough road network, and therefore they are critical for how London works. But also that roads have traditionally been a source of conflict between movement demands, local place issues. It's one of the few areas where most local residents interact with their councils. It's a bit like waste is the traditional one that people say, because issues like social services, education affect a number of people very strongly, that they don't affect the majority, whereas roads affect almost everyone, and almost everybody is interested. And that's why it's been a very difficult issue for many years to deal with, even at the time when focus was on movement more than anything else. Although more recently there's been a much more levels of support to tackle things like air quality and to improve the nature of place, as both Chris and Ben have said. They become more important both in terms of their position up the political hierarchy, but also in terms of things like the demands coming through from developers. If we want growth, we've got to have a good quality environment for people to plan their growth in, so that, if anything, that's made the issue slightly more pointed. We were all very pleased to be involved in the Roads Task Force work, and I'm not going to repeat everything that Ben said about the street types family. I think that's one of the big achievements to come out of that and has got a very large level of support. In principle, it will provide a really valuable tool for planning in the future. One of the other interesting things, just almost as an aside, that came out of the Roads Task Force from my point of view was it sort of diffused the old argument about, well, if you've got money to invest, you either invest it in the public transport network or in the road network, and it was an argument about who got the money. One of the conclusions of the Roads Task Force was, frankly, if you don't get the maximum number of people transferred onto walking, cycling or public transport, you don't stand a chance of doing anything with the roads. It will just be impossible in the future. And I hope that has sort of laid to rest some of the old argument about roads being public transport. We have to look at everything put together. Just to remind you some of the recent trends we've seen on London's roads. Traffic levels have stabilised and are declining in London, and that's been happening over decades now, notwithstanding national traffic forecasts which still say a 40% increase in traffic in London in the next 20 years or so. The reality is we have seen a stability there. The number of households with no cars has been increasing in London as well, and again that goes against national trends. Now very nearly 50% of households in London do not have access to a car, and that number has been going up, and that also is a reflection about how London works and what's important in London. More interesting, it's now become clear that young Londoners have only half the car ownership of older people. Well, that might seem obvious at one level because they've generally got less money, but it's also going to be a reflection for how things change in the future. The idea that getting a driving licence when you were 17 as a sort of rite of passage into young adulthood, which was the case maybe 20 years ago, is no longer that case. People drive later, they own a car later, and that also is going to have a reflection on how London has to plan for the future. And also the total number of cars registered in London has remained static despite increasing population growth over the years. Now that's not to say that that's going to carry on, that therefore we can do absolutely nothing, it won't matter, it'll all be perfectly all right, but it does put a bit of context into how we need to look at things. London's future growth has been touched on. Ben mentioned it. Is quite likely to lead to some growth in car ownership and use, but it will be in patchy distribution. One of the things that often surprises my European colleagues is that the wealthiest part of London has the lowest levels of household car ownership, which is around Kensington. And that's not because people can't afford to have it, it's basically because they've got nowhere to put the cars at night. Hence the plans for multiple basements in Kensington houses, some of which have gone ahead, some of which have been refused. A lot of that is to do with the fact there's nowhere to put a car at night. And that problem is a much wider problem than just in Kensington. In large parts of inner London now, overnight parking is at a premium. It is having a consequence in reducing car ownership levels because there's just nowhere to put them. But outside the centre, outside inner London, where we see growth happening, it is likely we will see growth in car ownership, certainly in terms of the total numbers, and use, particularly in outer London. So the distribution is quite patchy, and I suspect we'll be looking at different answers in different parts of London. I put that in, Ben has already said it, I don't think it's credible to suggest that the growth in road capacity will keep pace with population growth or anywhere like it. So we have to be looking at different options for the future. Quite a lot of the time we're looking at London-wide options, and we still do need to think about how we manage demand, because if we do nothing, then even with patchy growth, it will just lead to spreading of congestion. I don't personally believe it will lead to gridlock, but what it will mean is that congestion spreads geographically, it's more congested further out, it's more congested in places that previously were relatively free moving, it will spread by time of day. Already the idea that we have a morning peak and an evening peak is nonsense. We have virtually constant levels of traffic all during the day, but those morning peak rise is going to start earlier, the evening is going to last longer, it will happen at weekends. So we do still need to think about demand management, and there are lots of different ways we could look at that, but that's got to be something that remains on the agenda. And modal transfer I've already talked about, but it's going to be absolutely essential that we get as much as possible to go on those modes. More locally, and this is where the boroughs become important, there are a number of different ways in looking at this, some of which are already underway, such as local demand management through things like car-free housing. Those are areas where to buy or rent a house or an apartment, you're basically signing away your right to own a car in that area. There are also lots of place-led local schemes which may have overall traffic benefits as well, but are driven by the importance of improving the local place. And frankly, I suspect that almost anything to do with the roads in London, if it's going to be locally acceptable, has got to be driven by improving the place, not in the traditional way of saying, what can we do about improving movement? And by the way, we might get a benefit locally as well. It has to work the other way around. A lot of these will be small. On their own, you might say, well, that's very nice, but it doesn't do very much. But if you look at the cumulative impact of lots of local schemes, they do add up to a very significant change. Over the last 15 years, the cumulative impact of lots of small local schemes in central London has been to remove about 10 or 15% of the effective road capacity. Now, if you said as one scheme, that's what we're going to do, there would be a huge outcry. But that's what's been achieved by improving lots of little local environments, some street closures, the streetscape improvements that Chris mentioned, bus lanes, cycle lanes, they've all had that effect. Lots of little schemes can have a cumulative big impact for the better. Larger schemes are more difficult to achieve because of the scale of their impact. And Ben mentioned tunnels as one of the ways of doing it, and I suspect we might spend a lot of effort and time on tunnels without necessarily getting that far. Even where there's local support, they may in practice be quite difficult to achieve. Now, I look at the Hammersmith Dive Under as a touchstone on this because the surveys have shown the sort of 80 to 90% local support for replacing Hammersmith Flyover with an underpass. And if we can't get a scheme like that going where you've got such high levels of local support, then frankly it'd be difficult to get it going anywhere. But issues like costs going up, limited benefits, none of the proposals will actually take any traffic out of the Hammersmith Gyratory. Some of them will actually increase the traffic in the Hammersmith Gyratory. The portals, which will provide increased severance when the scheme was designed to reduce severance, and the implications of construction costs are all suggesting that it's just becoming a bit frayed at the edges. Well, I'll watch this one with great interest. If it's the most likely to succeed, if it doesn't succeed, then I think it's unlikely that anything else will get going, and there may just be expensive ways of shifting traffic from one location to another. Finally, just a quick word of strategic coordination. It's often thought that boroughs don't talk to one another. They actually do speak to each other quite a lot and work with TfL very closely to try and get specific schemes worked out. However, there will be issues over processes, over funding in the future. I think that may be where London Council has a role, but that will be one of the critical issues to watch if anything is going to work and and make a real difference on London's roads. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Nick. And so we heard comment about need for more walking, cycling, public transport coordination, and I think the whole aspect of active travel has to really just move higher up the agenda. And to talk to us about how can we learn from other countries in terms of active infrastructure, we have Philippe Christ, who's the Corporate Partnership Board Director of International Transport Forum. So, Philippe.
Thank you very much. So for those of you who don't know the International Transport Forum at the OECD, we're an intergovernmental organization that's based in Paris, representing 57 member countries at the level of transport ministries. And of course, one of the essential elements that these ministries have to deal with is urban transport. And in that context, active mobility is a key element on many of these, not all the countries' agendas. And I have to apologize today because I will be a bit reductive. I will not talk about walking specifically, although that is probably the key element of active mobility. And I won't do that because I believe, looking through our countries, that there's probably more that can be done and more that has still to be done to improve the cycling element of active mobility. So I apologize in advance. I don't mean to ignore walking, but I will focus on what it will take to make cycling supernormal. That is so plano, so actively involved in daily life that we no longer recognize it as a separate, unique element of the mobility mix. And this is how it is in many countries across our membership. And one of the things that I'll try to bring across to you in a very general overview in 10 minutes is what has made it supernormal in these countries to make cycling such an essential element of their daily mobility. And it'll start here. This is a man, and this is his bicycle. Now, in many places where cycling is relatively low and where it represents a small portion of the mode share, this man is disproportionately represented in the cycling public. He's largely unafraid of cycling in traffic. In fact, he finds that on-road traffic conditions are actually quite acceptable. And in this respect, he is wholly unrepresentative of the population at large. And my advice to cities seeking to increase cycling is to look at this man, look at him well, and forget about him. Because designing policies, especially for those cyclists that are already and based on those cyclists that are already cycling, will not deliver the great untapped benefits of widespread everyday cycling. This is a key lesson that we see across the best performing members of our membership. These are the people that you have to keep in mind when designing your cycling policies. Women and children. The older and the less fit. Not that those two necessarily go together. Those who have not grown up here and those that have grown up here. We will have to focus on all of those who do not cycle now and who will not cycle in the future unless their concerns and their expectations are addressed. When the demographic profile of cyclists in a city more closely matches the demographic profile of the general population at large in the city, in a place like London, in a place like Paris, in a place like Nashville, Tennessee, where I grew up, then we'll know that we're on the road to success. And as we take this non-cycling population into account in our policies, we'll have to address one fundamental question. Will we simply seek to make cyclists safe in an inherently unsafe traffic system? Caveat, this picture was taken a few years ago in London. I don't mean to say that London is the most unsafe traffic system around. There's been tremendous work done here to make it much safer. Or will we instead, where we would like to increase cycling, focus on making the traffic system safe for cyclists, making the traffic system safe for pedestrians from the get-go, from the outset, especially for those that are new to cycling? Now, the choice for countries like the Netherlands, like Denmark, and I'm not saying that these are the countries that cities like London should look to because they are quite high-performing. But the choice in those countries has been clear. They have taken the safe system approach and integrated it into all aspects of transport, of land use, and of traffic policy, at the national level, at the regional level, and at the municipal level. Making the traffic system safe will require revisiting our approach to traffic planning in major parts of our cities. Today, it is not easy to get from A to B by bicycle, or in walking in many cases, and certainly not in safe conditions. Now, the situation is a little better for public transport, but the choices that we've made over the past half century have mainly made it easy for cars to have access to and within our cities. This this will have to change. We need to make the city, not just in its center, also in the boroughs, more accessible to people, and especially people that are walking and cycling. And this is because walking and cycling are essential safety valves in the traffic mix, in our mobility mix. Now, this change is underway in many cities around and town centers throughout the world. Here we see the opening of a busy major arterial in Suwon, Korea, back into a pedestrian and cycling corridor that structures the active mobility network of that city. Here in Lisbon, we see very valuable urban space being taken away from cars, which are probably the least space efficient way to get around the city, and given back to people to sit, to walk, and to ride bicycles. And I want to come back on sitting and walking, because we've heard already today that those are essential elements in the urban streetscape that have tended to be forgotten as we focus, as Ben said, on movement. And here in my town of Saint-Germain-en-Laye, we've repurposed public street space that was used previously to store private cars that sat largely unused all day into core parts of a cross-town bicycle track network in a relatively small town, 60,000 people population. That's used by the young and the old to get around healthily, quietly, and rapidly. And there are literally hundreds and hundreds of examples like these around Europe, and more importantly, around the world, in places in South America, in Southeast Asia, and elsewhere. But we should resist the tendency, and I've shown some infrastructure here, and in fact, when I was introduced as speaking about infrastructure, but we should reduce the tendency to think that to make cycling supernormal, all we need to do is dig and transform the physical layout of our cities. This change will require infrastructure, but in many cases, not first and not foremost. It will require speed management, especially limiting speeds to 30 kilometers an hour, or better yet, 20 kilometers an hour, in those areas of the city where we want to increase walking and where we want to increase cycling. Speed management is perhaps the most effective safety intervention we can deploy. It is, in effect, the essential hidden infrastructure that makes cyclists safe, that makes pedestrians safe, that makes us safe in the cities. And I have to say here that the work that Ben just presented on what TfL is doing is essential work to understand where we can deploy these speed managed zones. The plan in Paris is that 96% of all streets would be managed at 30 kilometers or 20 kilometers or less. In Berlin, you have equally high numbers, and there's not any reason that in London you should not see an increase of the speed managed zones to 70, 80, perhaps even more, in terms of the number of streets, not necessarily in terms of the kilometers of streets. Now, where speeds cannot be lowered, infrastructure, preferably separated infrastructure, will be necessary. These investments will have to address occasional and new cyclists' perception of safety in order to entice them to ride their bicycle more habitually. But we'll also have to deliver real safety improvements, especially at junctions. And what's necessary is not separate infrastructure elements, but a real, cohesive, coherent, and comfortable network. A cycling network like that of Copenhagen, where nearly 50% of all work and school trips are taken by bicycles, as it is in many Dutch towns. Like that of Bremen in Germany, where a quarter of all trips are taken by bicycle. Or like that of Seville in Spain, that has gone from nearly zero cycling to 7%, over 7% now, in as many years. When deployed, these coherent, cohesive, comfortable networks result at first in a rapid rise in the number of new cyclists, and more importantly, in the number of new cyclists that were not represented in the cycling population before. And then they serve to maintain this level of cycling throughout the city and amongst the general population. Now, this type of infrastructure has benefits for the city as well. It's much less costly than roads to provide. It can be disruptive to put in place. I think London is experiencing that right now. It provides the same capacity as roads dedicated only to cars, and requires 1/4 of the space. And it is not too terribly expensive for the public authorities. And this is a lesson that we see being taken up in all cases, of all places, many cities in North America that are starting to invest in cycle track networks because of the BCA, the benefit cost assessments that they make, which are consistently high for these type of infrastructures. Not for all, but in many cases they provide true value for money, and this is especially important in a time of constrained budgets. But their deployment, the deployment of this type of infrastructure, and the extension of slow speed zones will involve arbitrations regarding street space and parking that will not always be comfortable, and especially for elected officials. There will be a temptation to install cycle tracks only where it would be easy and cheap to do so. There will be a temptation to put in place speed managed zones only where few people travel. Both of these temptations should be avoided, and those countries that have been most successful have successfully avoided these temptations. Cycle tracks should be built where they are necessary, that is where people travel, and where it is often both difficult and controversial. Speed restricted zones in the town centers, in the city centers of our neighborhoods should be the norm, as I said, not the exception, and that is a politically difficult proposition. These are precisely where the hardest battles have been fought. But there are also some unexpected benefits. Here I'll come back to that. One of the things I should say about fighting these battles is that it can only be done with the support from the ground up of NGOs, of neighborhood groups, of those that are locally rooted in the neighborhoods where these infrastructure will go in. Because we've seen consistently that top-down plans often fail without this local support. And this local support has to focus on the convenience of cycling, not on the speed of cycling. It has to focus on the everyday aspect of cycling, not on the sport aspect of cycling. It should focus on people that are dressed in everyday clothes, not just clad in lycra suits going to war on the streets. And when we have these type of cyclists involved and these type of people involved in the planning from the bottom up, we have seen successful implementation of these policies throughout our membership. So there are some unexpected benefits, and I'll finish on this. In New York City, when they deployed a number of temporary, then that became permanent cycle lanes, their assessment of those systems revealed that cycling went up tremendously on many of these tracks. Injuries went down predictably on many of these tracks because we know the research supports that. But what's more interesting is that the vehicular speed, the speed for the buses, for the cars, for the white vans, also went up. And this is an important lesson because good planning, good design, good infrastructure integration in the street network can benefit everyone. And so I'll finish on these words by Brent Todarian, the head planner for the city of Vancouver. When we prioritize, when we plan for active mobility, that makes it easier for the entire city to get around, including car drivers. But when we do the opposite, when we focus only on car travel, which historically has been the case, then our cities fail everyone, especially drivers. So thank you very much, and I look forward to the discussion.